Attention all grill masters and backyard barbecue enthusiasts. Lynn's has everything you need to make your 4th of July cookout a success. From sizzling certified Angus beef steaks and mouth-watering burgers to fresh-cut fruit and all the condiments you desire, we have you covered. Browse our weekly ad for celebratory savings like 39 cents per pound seedless watermelon through July 4th and shop online at lynsgrocery.com for extra convenience. Lynn's, where delicious begins.
History as it happens, October 8th, 2024. Hamas survives.
These Hamas militants wearing body cameras took off from Gaza on motorcycles loaded with weapons.
You can see people dancing at the Nova Music Festival with no inkling of the horror that's about to unfold.
More than 700 Israelis are now feared dead after unprecedented attacks by Hamas militants.
After their biggest and bloodiest breakout from Gaza.
More than 250 bodies have been recovered from the site of a music festival.
Murdering hundreds of women and children and massacring young people at a music festival and kidnapping innocent civilians further the cause of the Palestinians.
Hamas will understand that by attacking us, they've made a mistake of historic proportions. We will exact a price that will be remembered by them and Israel's other enemies for decades to come.
1 year after the worst loss of life in a single day in Israel's history, the perpetrator of the attack, Hamas, is battered yet survives. Less able to spill blood in Israel again than it was a year ago, still able to maintain its brutal grip on power in Gaza. Even as much of the Gaza Strip is in ruins. The past and future of Hamas, next as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
And the second thing that kind of surprises me is how little actors seem to learn about the other. I mean, the United States is still talking about day after plan to international community. I mean, Israel was very clear from the beginning. There was going to be no return to the status quo ante, and there would be a permanent Israeli security role in Gaza and so on. Hamas is still waiting for Israel to do something different than what it's doing. Actors are basically in the same place that they were a year ago, and I think that's largely not because their preferences have changed, but they just haven't really taken into account what the other actors are like.
This week, you'll read or listen to many moving reflections on what happened in Israel last October. The savage murders, kidnappings, the plight of the hostages still held in Gaza by Hamas, and how that day galvanized the Israeli public and provoked a massive retaliation whose stated purpose was to eliminate Hamas.
They are savages. Hamas is ISIS. And just as the forces of civilizations united to defeat ISIS, the forces of civilization must support Israel in defeating Hamas. I want to thank President Biden for his unequivocal support. I want to thank leaders across the world who are standing with Israel today. I want to thank the people and Congress of the United States of America. In fighting Hamas, Israel is not only fighting for its own people, it is fighting for every country that stands against barbarism.
Today, Hamas is not eliminated, but it is weakened. The militant Islamist group that has ruled Gaza for 2 decades maintains diminished control over Palestinians there. And whether it'll emerge from this war still in control remains to be seen. Much of Gaza is rubble. Neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, all destroyed. An estimated 41,000 Palestinians killed. And it's unknown who will rebuild the Gaza Strip. This is the first of a 2-part series examining the consequences of the 10/7 terrorist attack as Israel now wages war in Gaza and Lebanon as it fends off Iranian missiles. Nathan Brown is an expert on Hamas, a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. He has decades of knowledge and experience in the Middle East. And a year ago, he joined me on the podcast to talk about the origins of Hamas, a group that is poorly understood by most Americans. The title of that episode was Hamas. If you're interested in listening to it, you can find it wherever you find this podcast. Nathan Brown, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
I wish we had a more pleasant subject to discuss. Why don't we begin with a broad question? What about the past year has surprised you?
Well, the fact that we're dealing with a situation in which there's no end to the fighting, that doesn't surprise me. I guess I'm a little bit surprised about two things. First, virtually everything we said a year ago about the war is still applicable. I expected some change, some diminution. I didn't expect a clear day after, but I expected some kind of diminution, and that's not happening. And the second thing that kind of surprised me is how little actors seem to learn about the other. I mean, the United States is still talking about day after plans, international community. I mean, Israel was very clear from the beginning. There was going to be no return to the status quo ante, and there would be permanent Israeli security role in Gaza and so on. Hamas is still waiting for Israel to do something different than what it's doing. Actors are basically in the same place that they were a year ago. And I think that's largely not because their preferences have changed, but they just haven't really taken into account what the other actors are like. They just don't believe the words everybody else is saying.
Netanyahu's goal was and continues to be destroy Hamas. And it's not just critics of Israel or him who disagree with him. Major Israeli political and military figures, past and present, have said it is not possible to destroy Hamas. What are your thoughts on that, given the state of the war right now?
The goals were actually really vague in a way that I think didn't attract enough attention a year ago. It was not just destroy Hamas, but destroy their military and their governance capabilities. And what exactly that meant was not clear. And I think it was deliberately unclear. A whole number of different outcomes could have happened, and Israel could have said, well, they're not governing anymore. We killed most of their fighters, so therefore this is over. But the goals were defined in such a way that they could be open-ended and reconfigured to meet any situation, as most ambitiously defined, which is how some Israeli leaders sometimes talk about, including Netanyahu, talk of total victory. The idea that Hamas would just go away as a military force or as a political force just never seemed all that likely. You could inflict damage, that you could greatly affect the organization, that you could do all sorts of things. Those were possible, but making it disappear militarily and politically just wasn't going to happen.
And there's also been a ferocious debate, as you know, about who's responsible for the lack of a ceasefire, a lack of a hostage deal, which Israeli citizens are demanding from their government. Some people here in the United States point the finger at the Biden administration. Israelis, as mentioned, are pointing the finger at their own government. What about Hamas's responsibility or culpability in all this? What's your take on this debate?
Well, from the beginning, Hamas and Israel have been fighting different wars. And you almost have to agree what the war is before you agree on how to halt it. The basic issues blocking a ceasefire are clear, prisoner exchange or prisoner release, end of fighting and so on. But Israel has been pretty clear all along that what it was looking for was not like some kind of armistice, but a pause in the fighting and getting the hostages out. It was not interested in negotiating any semi-permanent arrangement with Hamas. And that makes an agreement very, very difficult, because what's in it for Hamas if the case is, if it's just about a momentary pause in the fighting? For Hamas, it's about continuing, getting Israel out and being able to declare victory. For Hamas, an Israel that promises that it will momentarily cease hostilities, but will be a permanent ongoing presence in the Gaza Strip, that's not a ceasefire for them. That's negotiating the terms of the conquest. And so that's been the basic stumbling block. And the Americans and other mediators, Qataris and so on, have been very good at generating language that can cover some of the issues. But the fundamentally different war that two sides are fighting can't be papered over.
So you were here about a year ago to discuss who is Hamas, where do they come from, what do they believe in, and why? And I think it's critically important to understand origins and motivations. It doesn't mean we're justifying the behavior. We have to understand why people act the way they do, why they believe in the things they do, and how we got to this point today. So along those lines, I want to talk about Hamas's leader, who has survived the war, as far as we know, living in the tunnels underground in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar.
A key moment leading up to the present Gaza crisis came in 2011, when in exchange for a single Israeli soldier kidnapped by Hamas, the Israelis released over 1,000 prisoners from their jails, none more famous than Yahya Sinwar. He had been incarcerated for 22 years after being sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms for murder. He was given a hero's welcome in Gaza and was quickly reintegrated into the Hamas leadership.
Given that Israel has assassinated a number of Hamas figures over the years, including its founder, with little to show for it, Hamas pulled off the 10/7 atrocity, despite having lost, as mentioned, their leaders over time to assassinations. And there have been a number of wars between Israel and Gaza as well, since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in around 2005, 2006. How important is Sinwar to Hamas's ability to keep fighting and survive the war?
I think short-term he actually is important. I mean, I think you're right about the effect of previous assassinations. Hamas is a very, very strong and resilient organization. You eliminate one leader and somebody else takes their place. And it's not that the assassinations have no effect, but they don't really decimate the organization. Right now, it's a little bit less clear simply because Hamas clearly has some kind of command structure that is able to continue operating. It's able to articulate its positions, its diplomatic positions, issue statements, and so on. And it's doing so when Sinwar is nowhere to be seen, literally nowhere to be seen. He's presumably hiding underground and moving around from place to place, presumably, but we don't know. So my guess, and this is just a guess, I've never been involved in fighting this kind of a war, if Israel were able to locate and kill Yahya Sinwar tomorrow, it would have an effect on the organization's coherence short term. I think long term, they would simply rebuild their command structure. It would also be a tremendous propaganda victory for Israel, and it would allow Israeli leaders, if they wanted to, and they may not, to just declare victory. Okay, we got Sinwar. We've killed lots of Hamas fighters. Now let's talk about post-war. It would allow that. But again, if you listen to Israeli leaders and if you take their words seriously, they're not interested in eliminating Sinwar or getting Hamas to act like this or that. They're interested in, essentially, I think they see themselves already in a forever war against Hamas. And it's a war that will require Israel constantly to act on its own in Gaza and the West Bank.
Well, Henry Kissinger, someone who I'm not fond of quoting, once said, "Guerrillas win by not losing." So I guess this isn't really a surprise that the war is not over yet.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Hamas boasts that it's playing the long game. It's not about winning this victory or that victory tomorrow. And I think, in a sense, that is true. A Hamas that is able to survive is going to be able to say to the world, to Palestinians, look, the Israelis tried to wipe us out, and they didn't. The world is going to have to deal with us at some point. So I think that actually is the war that Hamas is fighting.
So, Sinwar, I was reading a little bit about his background. I'd like to talk to you about that now because, the history here is not past. Not to get too dramatic, but, the history is coursing through the veins of all the principal actors in this conflict. Sinwar grew up in what is now Ashkelon. That was a Palestinian village up the coast from Gaza before 1948. So he's in his early 60s. His family fled to the Gaza Strip after the 1948 war. And it seems that his worldview is informed by this history, that he still wants to reverse the verdict of 1948 or at least 1967. Do you agree with that?
Certainly 67. It's not quite clear. I mean, there are all sorts of things about Sinwar that are clear. But this is a guy who is a practical leader who has a reputation for being tough, even ruthless, enforcing discipline within Hamas's own ranks, and obviously now in the current war. But it's not clear this is a long-term thinker or that he has any clear kind of long-term objective. He may, but that's not the kind of figure he is. He's a doer, he's an organizer, a forceful man, but not necessarily a strategic thinker. So you have people in Gaza, and Sinwar is from this background, who live almost walking distance from their ancestral homes. Okay, so the idea that this is in the distant past, no, it's actually almost literally on the horizon for them. And the idea of what happened in 1948 is still very, very much alive. But I think Hamas has always been led, it's funny, its international reputation as a terrorist organization, it's ruthless, it's violent, it's murderous, even anti-Semitic, genocidal. You hear all these kinds of words. The words that Hamas tends to use for itself, and even that other Palestinians talk about it, is it's pragmatic, it's practical. And sometimes it's even moderate or centrist. So how do they portray themselves that way? What they see themselves as doing is taking very, very difficult situations and saying, okay, here's what we're going to do about this now. We know we want liberation for Palestinians. The armchair intellectuals will work out the details. We're going to act today in order to organize them, in order to launch an attack, in order to provide services, in order to provide Palestinians what they need. We're kind of called by the Palestinian people, and we will meet their needs as those needs evolve. And so the organization ideologically, I don't think has a real solid core. It has a set of attitudes about Israel, about violent conflict, about the legitimacy of striking Israeli civilian targets. Those are all attitudes. But this is not like a communist party that has a catechism, or, it's not the Catholic Church. There's no communist manifesto. There's no catechism that says you have to say this, you have to believe this, or anything like that. It's more an organization that you join to serve the national cause.
Just listening to your remarks here, there will be people saying, gosh, I never thought of, pragmatism or practical thinker as a way of describing people who are often just viewed as fire-breathing fanatics who cannot be negotiated with. Is there room for negotiation? Like, for instance, the original charter that we discussed a year ago is not very compromising, right? There's no olive branch in that original charter. But it did present an addendum to its original charter in 2017 that removed explicit references to killing Jews, but still refused to recognize Israel. And there's also the notion that Hamas would be willing to live with a Jewish state, provided it goes back to its pre-1967 borders. Can you clarify that for us?
The short answer is no, because Hamas can't clarify it. Yeah. Or they clarify it with more and more words. I mean, I'll tell you, this is
deliberately vague, right?
Well, they're vague partly because they're papering over differences. And again, these are abstract or theoretical questions. I remember this was about 10 years ago. I was interviewing a Hamas leader in Nablus, and his son was there, who's also seemed to be very active in the organization. And I asked him about the possibility of accepting a Jewish state. And the older man basically replied, says, look, Hamas has a clear formula. An Islamic state in all of Palestine gives rights to everybody. Jews can have rights. Everybody can have rights. That's our solution. And then his son says, what my father says is absolutely correct from a religious point of view. But from a political point of view, Hamas accepts an independent Palestinian state on the 1967 lines. And I listened to this and I, okay. And then the father and son look at each other, they smile and they nod. They think they're agreeing. And they're saying the exact opposite. So I think for Hamas, the question is a negotiation possible, an agreement possible with Hamas? As I described, doesn't have a solid core. So in theory, it's possible. In theory, Hamas could evolve that way. In theory, it could evolve in very, very different ways. And the current generation is much less concerned with what its stand is going to be like 10 years from now and more what it's going to do today. And so my pessimism is based not on Hamas's core or soul, which I'm not sure is there, but with the fact that the current circumstances are just leading very radically in the opposite direction. Hamas is not evolving in that way.
And on the other side of the conflict, the United States, of course, views Hamas as a terrorist organization, so there's no contact with it. And in Israel, it's not just Netanyahu. I think there's broad support for continuing the war, or not going back to the status quo where you had kind of this modus vivendi with Hamas. But that raises the question, then, who are you going to deal with? Because the fundamental issue remains ordinary Palestinian people don't have autonomy, they don't have a state, and now where they were living has been leveled.
Yes, and I think that's a problem for the Israelis. In some ways, it's actually not a left-right split or a dove-hawk split. Who was it who was negotiating with Hamas prior to October 7th? It was a right-wing government. Who is it that's negotiating with them now? It's a right-wing government. So the Israeli government negotiates regularly with Hamas about ceasefires, movement of goods and that sort of things. About anything long-term, that's kind of where the split is. The Israeli right and the parts of the center basically now say it's not just Hamas that is an existential threat to the state of Israel. They're now on the record, a large majority of the Knesset voting saying a two-state solution, a Palestinian state, is an existential threat. The opposition in Israel has no real alternative to offer. They can't argue for a Palestinian state right now. They can't argue for trying to come up with some agreement with Hamas or with the Palestinian Authority. They just have nothing to offer. And it's deeply demoralizing for them because even those who do think, wait, we really ultimately will need a Palestinian state, find some way to avoid spelling that out in public. But right now, they're a minority. The idea that Israel has choices here about how to deal with the Palestinians is one that doesn't have an awful lot of purchase in Israeli political debates.
That's interesting. I was just speaking to Dalia Shenlin about what happened to the Israeli left. So I appreciate those insights. So another question that we grappled with a year ago, why did Hamas, their core leadership, why did they go ahead with the attack on 10/7 knowing what would happen? And I read an extraordinary essay by Shlomi Eldar, an Israeli journalist or filmmaker, who interviewed Palestinians that he knows who used to live in Gaza, who fled to Egypt once they knew something was going to come, because they knew that Israel would retaliate and it would be very difficult for them to get out of the Gaza Strip after that. He interviewed a fellow by the name of Abu Zaida, according to the story, was aware for the past 2 years the Hamas leadership had been talking about implementing the last promise, a divine promise regarding the end of days when all human beings will accept Islam. Sinwar and his circle, according to the article, ascribed an extreme and literal meaning to the notion of the promise, a belief that pervaded all their messages and speeches, sermons, lectures in schools and universities. The cardinal theme was the implementation of the last promise, which included the forced conversion of all heretics to Islam or their killing. Long story short, and I will share a link to this 43-page article in my newsletter. Long story short, the core leadership of Hamas believed it could defeat Israel. What's your take on this?
So I read the article, actually. It's fascinating.
Yes.
I will say I'm skeptical, but I will admit here that I may be a victim or a perpetrator of confirmation bias, right? So I ignore evidence that doesn't confirm with my previously held view. But I'll tell you what my previously held view is and why I still think I hold it. Hamas, as I say, is an organization that has this mentality, but no specific long-range plan or strategy. And the organization has all kinds of ideas or tendencies within it. I read what happened as October 7th, and I probably said this a year ago, as partly a contest within the organization. Diplomacy is not working, let's do something. And also a plan that was predicated on the realization that the Israelis have negotiated most seriously and given the most to Hamas when Hamas held hostages. So let's just go get some hostages and hunker down. And yes, they'll thunder and they'll roar and they'll undertake a military campaign, but we survived the past ones. And that's what I think happened. I still think that happened. When I see stories like this, sometimes they are based on some captured documents, which the Israelis seem to leak very, very selectively. I'm not accusing them of forging documents, but there was a time a few weeks ago when a public opinion poll came out that was inconvenient for the public Israeli line right now, so they released documents suggesting that Hamas was skewing public opinion poll results and that sort of thing. And it always seems very, very convenient. So if they want to convey the impression, look, Hamas is crazy and could never come to terms with them, that's the sort of account they would leak. So that's why I'm skeptical, but I'm not completely dismissive. There certainly are strains within Hamas that think much more religiously. The people that I have met and that I've interviewed tend to be sort of more practical people. They're engineers. They're religious, right? They pray. They're serious Muslims and so on. But they don't always think in those religious terms. So it's almost this eschatological end of days terms. But there are some within the organization. I've seen some organization publications that do kind of talk that way. Some of their rank and file will subscribe to that. So whether these are things to take seriously or whether these are mere words by some kind of hotheads or religious zealots within the organization, I can't say for sure.
You mentioned hostages there. I mean, that is how Sinwar got out of prison in 2011. He was one of many, many Palestinian prisoners swapped for a single Israeli, right? It was Gilad Shalit, the soldier who was kidnapped. Sinwar was in prison for murdering Palestinians, to the point about what was Hamas thinking a year ago. Did they really think they could defeat Israel? I've seen quotes from Sinwar over the years where he's talked about, I don't care how many Palestinians have to die in order for us to liberate our nation. I don't know how much weight you place into those either. Again, in this context of, what were they thinking and who is this leader? What's he willing to do to achieve national liberation, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, and again, it's very, very hard for me to say. I mean, there's certainly people who've met Sinwar, who interviewed him and so on. I'm not one of those. There are members of Hamas who are much more accessible because they're much more involved in society, or they're much more involved in politics or diplomacy. They were members of the parliament. They're foreign diplomats that are living in capital cities to represent Hamas. And those people tend to be a little bit more accessible, and you can get some sense of who they are and what drives them. Sinwar is clearly an inside guy. He even had much less of a public profile prior to October 7th. If you were to ask Palestinians, who do you think of when you think of Hamas? People in Gaza would probably mention Sinwar. Outside of Gaza, they wouldn't have known that much about him. And he's also a figure who is, as I say, less politically active, less diplomatically active. So he hasn't spent time kind of thinking about how is it that I make this case to a foreign audience. His audience is Palestinian.
As a non-expert here, I was surprised to learn that among the foreign entities or governments that have supported Hamas is Turkey, a NATO ally. Qatar is another one, obviously. The mowing the grass strategy that the Israeli government had pursued prior to what happened last October allowed Qatari money to flood into Gaza, used by Hamas to build up its fortress, underground fortress, etc. But what can you tell us about Turkey's relationship with Hamas? I was surprised about that one.
So Turkey has taken a role essentially of sticking up for the Islamic cause or the Arab cause in the region. I mean, and this goes back a while. If you remember back about 10 years ago, Erdogan basically sponsored an attempt to break the blockade by sending a flotilla to Gaza, which the Israelis forcibly stopped. So this is of long standing. So diplomatic support for Hamas, or treating Hamas as basically saying, hey, this is a legitimate political actor, you've got to talk to them. That's not uncommon in the region among a lot of different actors. And you named probably the chief one, I mean, the Qataris in Turkey. In terms of material support, that for me as an analyst is just harder to track. And the reason is that Hamas is a terrorist organization, not only in the United States, but there's international sanctions, and basically to keep them out of the banking system. It's very difficult to track this stuff. When Qatar gives aid, are they giving it to food? Who's dispersing it? How is it getting there? Is it coming in cash and suitcases, as some people sometimes allege? Is it coming in through international humanitarian organizations? There are people who know this information or have some sense of this information, but almost anybody who has it has some political agenda. So as an analyst, I hear this talk about the Hamas took this money and used it for building tunnels. And I'm not privy to Hamas finances, and I'm not privy to how it is that money is handled in Gaza. So I just have no way of assessing these claims.
How important is Iran today to Hamas a year in to this war?
It appears to be critical. They sort of talk that way, and Hamas people sort of talk that way. The relationship with Iran went through a rough period. In 2011, Arab uprisings all over, including in Syria, where Hamas was located. And Hamas, the leadership kind of made a decision, or different people within the leadership made a decision. This is an uprising which we want to be on the right side of. Islamists will probably do well, and they actually withdrew from Damascus, left Damascus. And Damascus was, of course, one of Iran's chief allies. So there was a rough period where Iran said, wait a second, you're supposed to be in our camp, and you're abandoning one of our chief friends in the region. And that relationship has been slowly rebuilt over the last 5, 6, 7 years or so. So again, Hamas's primary constituency is Palestinian. But when they look for international support for a diplomatic outlet, they look clearly primarily to Qatar, but they clearly also get some kind of support from Iran in Gaza and perhaps in the West Bank as well.
Hamas has an important office in Qatar. That's kind of where their political operation is based, right?
Yes, and the Qatari government says, to the Americans and to the Israelis and others, hey, wait a second, you want to negotiate with them, you need to know where they are. We've got all their mobile numbers, and we know which hotel or safe house they're in. So we're doing you a favor. So the Qataris get pretty prickly about this, whether it goes beyond simply hosting them to financial support for the organization itself. As I say, it's plausible, but it's unclear to me.
I was going to say that's where the Taliban was set up as well, so the U.S. could negotiate with the Taliban to agree to the withdrawal from Afghanistan a few years ago. So wrapping up here, we have touched on this already, but we'll wrap up with this issue again. As I consider a lot of the historical developments that have led to this, Sinwar's history, his being released from prison in 2011, then he orchestrates an attack on Israel years later, the mowing the grass strategy, Israel's initial support for Hamas in the late 1980s. It seems that as stunning as 10/7 was, it's really no surprise to find ourselves in this disaster today, and that is because that underlying fundamental reality has not been dealt with, something that David Ben-Gurion said many years ago, that until the Palestinian case is resolved, we're never going to have peace. But this is not the first outbreak of violence since 1948. It's a cycle. I mean, that's why they call it the cycle of violence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd go back to you saying, unless the Palestinian issue is resolved, going to be in a state of continuous conflict. Almost everybody agrees with that, but their emphasis is different. And for the current Israeli leadership, they say exactly right. And the Palestinian case is never going to be resolved to their satisfaction. So we're in endless conflict. Maybe some future generation of Palestinians will wake up and smell the coffee for the hard right, or maybe they'll just leave, or maybe, they're not even Palestinians. Palestinians is a national community. We're not dealing with a national community. We're dealing with a bunch of people who are welcome to stay as long as they stop causing trouble. So there are those views. I think the idea that the Palestinian issue is resolvable is one that is not persuasive now to the majority of Israelis, and that's what explains an awful lot of what is going on. And on the Palestinian side, the idea that there's a solution that is known, that is just around the corner, that there's a peace process, it's an Oslo process, there's international support for a two-state solution. Well, my parents heard that. And my grandchildren will be hearing the same thing. It's just not happening. And so what is, I guess, distressing about the situation is right now is not just that the conflict is continuing, but that it's continuing in such an awful form. I met somebody who once said essentially what you're looking at in Israel and Palestine right now is not a traditional conflict. It's a race war. And it's gotten that ugly. It will probably stay that ugly, I think, at least for if you have me on a year from now, I would guess that might still be the premise of the conversation.
Well, didn't you contribute to that article that made waves, one state reality, right?
Yes. And a lot of people misinterpreted that, saying, okay, they're endorsing a one-state solution. And I wish there were a solution. This is the reality. There's a single state. And what we're witnessing right now is struggle over the terms of life within that single state.
Yeah, the coalition governing Israel now has endorsed a one-state solution, but it's totally one-sided. To your point about the two-state solution, we can talk about that as a resolution. It is not a solution to the current Israeli government and even successive Israeli governments by now. It's a problem. I mean, Netanyahu's never supported a two-state solution. What I'm getting at is the annexation of the West Bank, de facto or de jure, is underway.
Yes, and the special arrangement for Gaza, which was essentially a blockade, Israel controlled everything that went in and went out, but what went on inside was not their problem. That's over now as well.
I decided to come here to speak for my people, to speak for my country, to speak for the truth. And here's the truth. Israel seeks peace. Israel yearns for peace. Israel has made peace and will make peace again. Yet we face savage enemies who seek our annihilation, and we must defend ourselves against these savage murderers.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to take a view from 30,000 feet up of the greater Middle East. You'll recall that before October 7, 2023, a top U.S. official named Jake Sullivan said the Middle East was as quiet as it had been in 2 decades. Well, that was an illusion. Where is the Middle East heading today? What is the U.S. role in it? Does the U.S. have real influence over its allies or enemies in the region? That is next as we report History as It Happens podcast from the Washington Times.
Okay, it's official. We are very much in the final sprint to Election Day. And face it, between debates, polling releases, even court appearances, it can feel exhausting, even impossible to keep up with. I'm Brad Mielke. I'm the host of Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. And every morning, my team and I get you caught up on the day's news in a quick, straightforward way that's easy to understand, with just enough context so you can listen, get it, and go on with your day. So, kickstart your morning. Start smart with Start Here and ABC News, because staying informed shouldn't feel overwhelming.